Forever linked in friendship, in war, and in death, this is a brief tale of two African American heroes. Thomas R. Hawkins, pictured on the left, and Christian A. Fleetwood, pictured on the right, were two black men, both born in the year 1840. Fleetwood grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and Hawkins near Cincinnati, Ohio. Both grew up free men and were educated, with Fleetwood graduating valedictorian from what would later become Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, one of America's first HBCUs. Hawkins, noted to be a plasterer, a trade noted to be that of a master craftsman, required great skill and intelligence. In the summer of 1863, Fleetwood and Hawkins would make the brave yet dangerous decision of joining the United States Colored Troops, or USCT for short, which was an organization designed for the recruitment and service of African Americans in the American Civil War. Fleetwood would join the 4th USCT out of Baltimore, Maryland, and around the same time, Hawkins would join the 6th USCT out of Camp William Penn near Philadelphia. Both soldiers demonstrated high intelligence and great leadership skills and were immediately promoted to the rank of sergeant major of their regiments, making them the highest ranking black soldiers in their units. Their first duty station was in Yorktown, Virginia, where they learned the necessary skills for being a soldier. As sergeant major of their regiments, not only did they have to learn the basic arts of soldiering, but they also had to make sure the other non commissioned officers, like corporals and sergeants in the regiment, learned those skills and could teach them to their enlisted men. They were also responsible for much of the daily, weekly, and monthly reports due to the commanding officers of the regiment. This required a high level of intelligence, organization, and leadership skills that surpassed the average person of that time. It was during this time in Yorktown that the 4th and 6th USCT were camped near each other, and Sergeant Majors Fleetwood and Hawkins became fast friends. Fleetwood, a prolific writer and journalist, mentioned Hawkins as having education and interest that matched his own. The two men would spend the entire fall and winter of 1863 getting to know each other in camp while they mastered the art of soldiering and leading their men in different forays across the state of Virginia. Both of these highly educated men must have considered some of the historic irony while training on the hallowed ground of Yorktown, Virginia, for there, only 90 years before, all of our forefathers, white or black, north or south, free or slave, fought to rid our fledgling nation of British tyranny and oppression. Black men in integrated units from several American colonies, including the famed Rhode Island Regiment pictured here, noted for having several companies of black men, fought side by side back then. But somehow, during the 90 years in between, the United States of America completely lost its way. It almost completely forgot the honorable service of its colored men, hardly free themselves, but fighting for the very freedom of this fledgling nation. They'd forgot about Crispus Attucks being the first to die for the cause in the Boston Massacre, or the valor of Peter Salem and Solomon Poor, pictured here at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Brave New Jerseyans like Oliver Cromwell of Burlington, New Jersey, who crossed the Delaware with Washington on his way to conquer Trenton, or the unfortunate Stephen Sutphin of Somerset, New Jersey, who fought honorably at the Battle of Brooklyn, only to have his master renege on his promise of freedom after the war. Now in completely segregated regiments, the 4th and 6th USCT fought to free America from the yoke of a different oppressor, one who would spread the enslavement of their brethren from sea to shining sea, and keep them as perpetual third-class members of this society. But this oppressor's time was soon coming to a bitter end, and Sergeant Majors Hawkins and Fleetwood would have a hand to play in that game. In the spring of 1864, as members of the same brigade, the 4th and 6th USCT would often end up fighting side by side, with Fleetwood and Hawkins leading their men through at least 4 bloody engagements in Virginia. On June 15th, 1864, the 4th and 6th USCT were side by side most of the day, fighting in two separate battles, one at Baylor's Farm, pictured here, and the charge on the Dimmock Line near Petersburg, Virginia. Both battles resulted in African American troops capturing fortified Confederate positions while under heavy fire, this possibly being the first time a capture like this occurred for black troops during the war. The fighting was absolutely brutal that day, with both regiments losing heavily to rifle and artillery fire early on at Baylor's Farm, and nearly faltering before the 22nd and 5th USCT of their brigade swooped in to capture the rebel position. Both units would later redeem themselves that afternoon in the bloody charge on the Dimmock Line, where they stormed multiple artillery batteries, taking them after hard fighting that often became hand to hand. It's not known exactly when, but at some point that day, Sgt Major Hawkins was severely wounded by artillery shrapnel to the elbow. He would spend 8 weeks at Balfour Hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, recovering. Sgt Major Fleetwood, for the most part, emerged physically unscathed, although later in life he would remember June 15, 1864 as the bloody tragedy at Petersburg, Virginia, indicating he may have suffered from a degree of PTSD in remembering the bloody affair. Although these units cracked the Dimmock Line that the Confederates built to defend the city of Petersburg, Grant's Army of the Potomac could not capitalize on these gains, and their follow up attacks advanced only with moderate gains due to Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia reaching Petersburg in time to blunt Grant's attacks. Petersburg would then settle into a bloody 10-month-long siege. On September 29th, 1864, both Fleetwood and Hawkins would be in for the fight of their lives at the Battle of Newmarket Heights, also known as the Battle of Chapin's Farm, only a short distance from the main prize of Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. This was a hard-fought battle in which the 4th and 6th USCT would once again fight side by side and would charge alone up a hill through swamps and field obstacles against the vaunted Texas Brigade of the Army of Northern Virginia. The Texans had become grizzled veterans in some of the hardest fought battles of the war, including such places as Gaines' Mill, Second Manassas, Antietam, and Gettysburg. These were arguably the best soldiers the Confederacy had, seasoned killers, who, although battle weary, were absolutely enraged to be attacked by colored troops. It was a brave attempt to dislodge these veteran Texans from a fortified position against nearly impossible odds. In doing so, both black regiments were met with great slaughter, as hundreds of men were killed, wounded, and captured, bravely charging the positions. It must be noted that some of the men that were captured by the Texans were immediately murdered, as the Texans and Arkansas's men of the brigade were enraged at fighting blacks, whom they presumed to be their lessers. Both black regiments made it near the enemy positions, but had lost so many men that their officers decided not enough men were left to take the positions. During the advance and eventual retreat, the color guards and color bearers of both regiments suffered horrendous casualties, as men carrying flags were usually the most visible targets on the battlefield and typically had a lower life expectancy. It's important to note the tremendous importance of a regiment's battle flags or colors during the American Civil War. Your regimental colors were a point of pride. Oftentimes, they were sewn or given to you from your local community or through charitable donations from an organization that was friendly to the regiment. The national colors literally symbolized what you were fighting for: freedom and the land of red, white, and blue. Most state regiments had state colors affiliated with their state of origin. USCTs were federally designated regiments and not affiliated with states. Therefore, they had regimental colors like these on the right. Either way, they were a point of pride for the men. They represented your honor and the causes you fought for. To lose them was a major blow. Additionally, these flags had a tactical purpose by letting others know where your unit was on the battlefield. This also, unfortunately, let the enemy know where you were as well, which is why casualties amongst the unit's color guard and color bearers were extremely high. As you can tell, and this slide showing the national colors of the 4th USCT on the left, which made it very close to the lines of the Texas Brigade, some of these flags were shot to ribbons, along with the men that carried them. Both Hawkins and Fleetwood, seeing their color bearers killed, stepped up and rescued their regiment's flags from capture, making themselves immediate targets to the Texans, but somehow bravely carrying them off the field and retaining the honor of their regiments. Hawkins would suffer 3 wounds in the process, with Fleetwood saying after the battle that Hawkins' recovery from these fearful wounds was deemed hopeless. Yet somehow, his friend Hawkins would indeed recover, but this would be his last battle of the war. Fleetwood would somehow emerge yet again physically unscathed. Although the attack of the 4th and 6th USCT failed and would suffer 400 casualties out of the 700 men that made the attack, a second Black Brigade, made up of Ohio, North Carolina, and Maryland and Virginians, would attack immediately after them, putting relentless pressure on the Texans, now forced to fight off 2 immensely determined attacks. And as a result, the Texas Brigade and their supports were forced to pack up and retreat, some of them doing so in quite a hurry and suffering casualties in the process. As a result of this victory, 14 U.S. colored troops were awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest honor that can be bestowed upon a U.S. soldier. These 14 men included Hawkins and Fleetwood for so nobly saving the colors of their regiments. It's important to note that Hawkins is depicted in this Don Troiani painting called 3 Medal of Honor Winners, depicting Hawkins, Sergeant Alexander Kelly, and Lieutenant Nathan Egerton in their brave efforts to save the colors of the 6th USCT. This painting now resides at the Union League in Philadelphia, forever honoring these men and their sacrifice to our nation. The more healthy Fleetwood would gain some sense of redemption the next day as his unit would participate in the defense of Fort Harrison, just a few miles down the road. The 4th and 6th USCT, along with several other white brigades, would have their revenge as they shot down Confederate assaults on their positions, causing them to retreat in bloody disorder themselves. It was indeed an awful war. After the war, both men would end up in Washington, D.C., and land good jobs working as clerks in different federal departments. Hawkins is noted to have been in D.C. first, before Fleetwood, having married and found a job working for the IRS. Fleetwood had taken a bookkeeping job in Ohio, but in 1867 moved to D.C. to accept a clerk's position for another government agency. One can only assume that Fleetwood's good friend Hawkins played some role in this decision. Fleetwood would receive his Medal of Honor in 1865, shortly after the war, but the ailing Hawkins would not receive his until February 1870. Severely plagued by his war wounds, Hawkins would die young, at the age of 30, in March 1870, weeks after receiving his medal, and leaving behind a wife and children. Fleetwood, pictured here later in life, would go on to marry Sarah Iredell, the granddaughter of Louisa Burr, whom was the illegitimate mixed-race daughter of Aaron Burr. Christian and Sarah had a daughter named Edith and became important members of the black social elite in Washington, D.C. Sarah became a revered nurse and educator, noted for being one of the first graduates of Howard University's School of Nursing and serving as an advocate for the rights and education of colored women. Despite suffering from hearing loss as a result of gunshot concussions from his war years, Fleetwood would somehow end up as the choir master of 4 churches and would form some of the earliest Black Cadet and National Guard units in Washington, D.C., inspiring future generations of young Black men in the area to sign up for military service, including for World War I. He would also go on to do some public speaking for Black audiences, one of his more noted speeches being turned into a short textbook of about 25 pages, taken from a speech he gave at the Cotton States and International Exposition in 1895. Fleetwood died of heart complications in 1914. Both Fleetwood and Hawkins were initially buried in Columbian Harmony Cemetery in Washington, D.C., But when that cemetery closed in the 1950s, both men were reinterred in graves right next to each other in National Army Cemetery in Hyattsville, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., in PG County. These two heroes, connected by war, connected by friendship, connected in life, and connected in death, can now rest, and like all our ancestors, we honor them.